big question, the empty tomb. What are your thoughts on this? Is this sort of constructed narrative, or is there any truth to this? Is there anything pointing to this?
I have a highly controversial view on this for scholars. It may not be controversial for your listeners. Um, for years and years and years, I thought that there must have been an empty tomb. That however, even when I was an atheist, I thought, however you might want to explain it, we just have overwhelming evidence that the tomb was empty. And now I don't think so. Um, I About 10 years ago, I started looking into it, and what I looked into, I mean, of course, our only stories about it are in the Gospels. Um, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all talk about Jesus not being in the tomb. Paul doesn't say anything about it. The others don't say anything about the tomb being empty. They do talk about Jesus being raised from the dead. They talk about him appearing to people, but they don't talk about a tomb being empty.
Right.
And people are so used to the tomb being empty, they just assume it happened. So what I did is I looked up. So I was interested in what Romans did to crucified victims.
Hmm.
When you crucify somebody, what happens to the body? And I looked up every reference I could find in every Greek and Latin author from the ancient world about crucifixion.
Wow.
And most of them don't say anything about what happens to the remains. But when they do talk about the remains, what they virtually always say is that the bodies were left on their crosses to decompose on the crosses so that the birds would eat them, as part of the punishment. And the idea was that in the ancient world, people today, everybody today wants a decent burial today, but in the ancient world, this was a really, really big thing. You had to have a decent burial. And the Romans basically were flipping them the bird and saying, yeah, you're going to rot on the cross. And then, and so once they rotted on the cross for, a couple of weeks, they let them bury them or something. But so I don't think Jesus could have been buried on the day he was crucified, because Romans didn't do that. And there are only a couple of exceptions to that are really highly exceptional. So I talk about this actually in my book, How Jesus Became God. I marshal the evidence, and I try to show that Jesus almost certainly was not buried on that day. And so I think that there wasn't an empty tomb. I don't think anybody even knew about a tomb. I don't think there was a tomb. I think a couple weeks later they threw him in a ditch or something, like they do with most people.
That's interesting. And do you think the Romans would have not let a Jew like Joseph of Arimathea, for example, you don't think they would let him just come in? Hey, I'm going to take him down. Is it okay with you guys? I'm laughing.
We don't want to punish him.
Right.
I mean, it's like saying, like, no.
Yeah.
Well,
I started laughing as I'm saying it because it sounds so ridiculous.
Just people don't understand
walk up in there and be like, hey, I'm going to take this guy down from the. Is it okay with you guys? Is it all right?
I mean, Romans were, especially Roman administrators, had to work with a very iron fist,
right?
Because and Pilate was known for being completely ruthless. He didn't give a damn what the Jewish authorities. He of course didn't want to riot, and so he took care of things when things were getting out of hand. But it happened twice in his career, and it's when you have hundreds of people lining up in protest. It's not when this Jesus that he's just crucified is a nobody. Nobody's heard of him. He's like this. He's come from Galilee. He doesn't even live in Jerusalem. Doesn't have any family there. Doesn't have any. It doesn't have. And so the idea that some guy went up to Pilate and said, "Oh, can I have the body? Oh, sure, take him." No, it didn't work like it just didn't work like that. So I don't think there was an empty tomb. But I say that is controversial. Most scholars think I'm like, really?
Where do you think that legend comes from then? If it's
yeah. No, that's the question then. Why do you have an empty tomb? The reason you have an empty tomb is because the early Christians believed that Jesus got physically raised from the dead. They thought that because several of the early Christians had visions of him. I mean, I think they really did have visions of him. I think, people like, I think Peter probably, and Mary probably, and later Paul and others, maybe others, at least those three, I think almost certainly thought they saw Jesus alive afterwards. And in that day, if you're a Jew in that day, if you think you see somebody alive after they're dead, that means they got raised from the dead. Their body's been raised from the dead. The tomb was a story that developed over time to explain they really was bodily raised from the dead.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense. And so I'm thinking about all the writers of the time period. You got Philo, you got Seneca, you got Plutarch later on, you got, and there's, I could probably list like 20 voluminous authors who, Pliny the Elder wrote an encyclopedia in that area. He wrote about the Essenes, he wrote about miracles, he wrote about prodigal births, and they don't seem to it seems that they don't know who Jesus is yet. And my question is, is this such a small group of followers that is this what's going on? It's just so small that no one knows who it is until later on, and it just slowly grows up.
I think the problem is that people think that, they say, well, if the Gospels are right, he's feeding 5,000 men at one time. That's not counting the women and children. There must be 13,000 people there, and there are crowds everywhere. You can't even get into a city. There's so many crowds. There's thousands, tens of thousands of people, and so since Philo doesn't mention him or Pliny the Elder, well, that shows that he didn't exist. No, what? It shows that he didn't have all those followers.
Right. That's a good
So,
point.
so you have to ask yourself, the high priest when Jesus was like a teenager, a very important, the key figure in all of Israel at the time was Annas, the father of Caiaphas. How many times is he mentioned by Philo, or by Pliny the Elder, or by Seneca, or by Plutarch, or this is the most person in that entire country. How often is he mentioned? He's never mentioned. Why would they mention him? So let alone some itinerant preacher from Galilee who's got a small following and ended up becoming the most important person in the history of the Western world.
Right.
But he wasn't at the time. So it doesn't mean he didn't exist. It meant he wasn't the Gospels have exaggerated his importance during his day. It's impossible to exaggerate his importance now. You have over 2 billion people who worship him. So like, who else you got that going for him? But at the time, no.
That's a really good point.
I mean, no historian would expect those people to mention him.
That's a really good point. And another thing I like to, people don't realize is paper, papyrus, parchment. This was not cheap and easy to find. You had to find a scribe who can write, who's literate. Very rare. You also sometimes you had to take animal skins and do some sort of really intense process to make paper. So like, this is not like some guy can be following Jesus around and pulls out a pencil and a paper and just starts writing stuff down. This is the process. Yeah. You need funding for.
Yeah, but no, his disciples were not taking notes.
Right, and I think that's really important to point out. And when you talk about mythicism versus historicism, the Crestus character that's mentioned, I think in Tacitus, I think Suetonius. Is this the same person as Jesus, or is this a different? Because I hear that he might be a Roman slave, or something like that.
It's hard to know. What Suetonius is writing about an action undertaken by Claudius, who was a Roman emperor about 30 years after Jesus, 25 years after Jesus' death. And Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome because of some uprisings of some kind. And Suetonius, who's writing 60 years later, 70 years later, says that Claudius did this because these riots, and the riots were instigated by Chrestus, Chrestus. And for a long time, a lot of people thought that this is a reference to Christ, Christos. It'd be a misspelling, but that Suetonius just probably didn't understand that he meant Christos. And the idea there is that you had in Rome at the time, you had Christians who were Jews who were following Jesus as the Messiah, Jews who were not following Jesus the Messiah, and they're arguing it out, and it's leading to fighting in the streets. And so he said, "Out of hell with all of you," kicks them all out of Rome. That was the theory. And a lot of people still think that. A lot of Roman historians often think that. So it's not a religious thing. It's just Roman historians often think that. Other people think that Chrestus is just the name of the person who started these riots. And Chrestus is a name that is sometimes assigned to slaves in the period. And so we don't know what the situation is. We don't know whether it's riots over whether Jesus is the Messiah, or if it's some Jewish slave or some other person named Chrestus who for some reason is a controversial figure and that's led to some kind of riots. Don't really know.
It's a good point. The last thing I want to touch on is the Josephus interpolation, because he writes about brother of Jesus in one area of his writing, but he also writes about Jesus, who was called the Christ. And my question is, how much of that do you think is interpolation? How much of that do you think was originally written by Josephus?
So it's a debated issue, and of course, mythicists want to throw the whole thing out. Um, and usually, usually you have to like wonder what. I mean, you have to look at people's motives for wanting to do things, because if Josephus mentions Jesus, that's kind of a problem. It's not an insurmountable problem, because you could still say he's made up. But Josephus is a historian of the first century, and he records a lot of events about a lot of people, and a number of people also named Jesus. I mean, Jesus was a common name, and so there are other people he talked about named Jesus. But there are two references to Jesus in the writings of Josephus in his book, The Antiquities. The Antiquities is a 20-volume work that traces the history of the Jewish people from Adam and Eve up to Josephus's day. That's a great history. It's like writing the history of Americans, starting with Adam and Eve. Whoa. But he has two things he says about Jesus. In chapter 20, the second reference it's a story about somebody named James, who is the brother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Josephus seems there to be referring back to somebody he's already referred to, because he's telling you which Jesus it is. Right. Which Jesus, the one that's called the Messiah. In book 18, he actually has a paragraph that he devotes to Jesus, where he says that at this time there was a man, if you can call him a man, named Jesus, and he was the Messiah. And then he goes on to talk about his teaching, his followers, and that he got in trouble with the leaders of the Jewish people, who handed him over to the Roman authorities, who then executed him when Tiberius was the emperor. And so he has this paragraph that describes kind of the nuts and bolts that you would probably get from the Gospels. That Jesus was a teacher, did amazing things, and got crucified because. And so it seems to confirm the very, very, very basic outline of what we know about Jesus historically and from the early Christian sources. And the question is, did Josephus write that? And if he wrote it, did he write all of it or some of it, or how do we know? And so the widespread view, I think still widespread view, is that Josephus wrote most of that, but he certainly didn't write all of it. Because in this paragraph, he says Jesus was the Messiah, and he says that he was raised from the dead on the third day to fulfill the scriptures.
It's like he just writes the Nicene Creed just right there. Just
exactly. Yeah. The Nicene Creed. It's like, so, but we know Josephus never became a follower of Jesus. We have his autobiography, so we know he never became a follower of Jesus. And so it looks like the deal is that Josephus was a persona non grata among Jews throughout most of history, because he was thought to be a traitor to the Jewish cause during the Jewish war, and for reasons I don't need to get into, but he tells it in his own writing. He tells them what he did, but he was a turncoat in their opinion. So Jews did not preserve his writings. His writings were preserved by Christian scribes. And the general thought is that what happened is Josephus wrote that section about Jesus, and he just says some basic things about him. Some people called him the Messiah. He did weird things, amazing deeds, and he's said to have done amazing deeds. He taught, and they got in trouble with the law, and they crucified